I would first of all like to introduce the illustrious panel. I had a wonderful experience working with LISC and the Federal Reserve. I've spent about the last 17 years thinking about the issues of displacement and equitable development in the United States. And so in trying to think through what would be a meaningful conversation in this era of the forces at work, we came to this idea of finding experts from other high-cost cities that were experiencing high degrees of displacement that might have relevant things to say to our biggest city. I have with me Lisa Bates at your far left. And Lisa is an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. Portland is one of the first communities that drew an urban growth boundary and said everything's going to happen inside of this, which put a lot of pressure on existing land uses. And through eras of urban redevelopment and other things, most of the communities of color have been pushed out of the city of Portland to the county. And Lisa has been a leader in helping those communities think about rights to return and of new policies that can anchor those communities. Olson Lee is next to me. And he serves as the director of the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing. And before that, he headed the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, which in the state of California were our biggest engines of affordable housing and other urban reinvestment strategies. And Olson has been playing a really important role in helping advise other cities in the Bay Area, like the mayor of Oakland, in helping think about comprehensive housing policies. He's a really valuable resource in our Bay Area community. Next to me then is Wacolda Reyes, who is the Vice President of Real Estate Development from the Resurrection Project, isn't that a great name, in Chicago. And she has been leading this community development corporation, and she has been sitting on Mayor Rahm Emanuel's City Affordable Housing Task Force. And so she can help us think about the forces at play in Chicago. And then next to her is Devin Quirk, who is the Director of Operations for the City of Boston's Department of Neighborhood Development, and they work through real estate, homelessness assistance, home ownership, and rental preservation to restore Boston neighborhoods for the whole community. And finally, Tony Toe, who's the Executive Director of HomeSite, a Seattle-based community development corporation that has really been a leader through the Obama administration's Sustainable Communities Initiative and thinking about where the communities of color are located throughout the Seattle region and how to anchor them as they're expanding transit systems and how to bring new developments. And he was the vice president of that initiative, and he co-chairs the Regional Equity Network, which is a very awesome coalition of justice-focused partners. So with that being those great introductions, I'd just like to make a few opening remarks. One of the things that PolicyLink has been thinking about is since the recession, a lot of things have changed in the landscape of housing policy, of housing resources, of communities' experience of stability. And so we decided to spend last year documenting those. I had brought this report, Healthy Communities of Opportunity. My colleague will be tweeting out the link if you weren't able to pick one up. But I just wanted to say a few of the things that are the meta environment are the ecosystem that we're operating in. So first of all, the economic downturn that was caused by the foreclosure crisis stripped generations of wealth, out of communities of color and displaced them from home ownership with bad credit ratings. So we all of a sudden had just millions more people out in the rental housing market putting pressure on just the rental housing market. Then we saw the influx of new financing strategies by LLCs and the investment community being securitized and cash buyers coming from overseas. And so that created a new environment that also our affordable housing and home ownership, lower and moderate income homeowners had never operated in before. We saw then, because of the recession, the collapse of federal, state, and local budgets. And so all of the resources that were formerly going into financing affordable housing got rolled back. So all the policy gains that we had made were all of a sudden, our feet were out from under us. Then this was happening at the same time as the re-urbanization of America. And so after decades of population decline in our cities, of white flight from the suburbs, we saw people coming back to the cities. And at the same time, in the restructuring post-recession, we saw many more jobs. The jobs that had been $23 to $30 an hour jobs came back as minimum wage jobs. And so we saw jobs being added at the bottom and the top of the income scale. Then we saw that when people were facing displacement, this was mentioned in the last panel, if you were lower income, you got pushed to a worse neighborhood than where you started. So people were experiencing, 17 million people now have housing costs, 17 million households have housing cost burdens. And those paying more and living in a worse neighborhood has terrible impacts on health, education, and future earning outcomes. So and other disruptions that were going on in these high-cost cities, we're seeing the explosion of things like Airbnb, taking housing off the market and putting it into the hotel sector. And finally, we see that all of this is an incredibly racialized dynamic, that the people who lost their homes were primarily African American and Latino, that the people who lost their jobs and got lower wage jobs are in communities of color, and that the communities most facing displacement right now are communities of color. And so I think that the trends that we're seeing on the positive side of the ledger, which my colleagues up here are going to talk to you about, is that in this environment we've seen the incredible strengthening and growth of local and nationwide organizing networks. We're seeing comprehensive housing plans, like we just heard from the state of New York, coming out in these high-cost cities that are directly focused on anti-displacement. We're seeing new bond, general fund, and rent regulations. We're seeing healthcare providers jumping into the housing policy debates because of the effects they're seeing and the requirements they have through the Affordable Care Act to actually address community needs. And we're seeing, as Karen Chappell mentioned, this turning of our affordable housing tools to the preservation of housing rather than the building of new. And so those are some of the dynamics at play that I think we are going to dive in deeper to see how different cities are working on those things. So with that, without further ado, I have asked each of our speakers to spend 2 minutes laying the context for what the framework that is operating in their city is and who it's meant to protect. And I know this is a very difficult challenge to do in 2 minutes, so they each have 1 or 2 slides, and I am going to put my little bell, my sweet little bell on, so that they know when their time is up. So I think, first of all, I am asking Lisa to frame what is going on in Portland, Oregon.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. The city of Portland has been working in earnest on equitable development for about perhaps the past 5 years, starting with the adoption of a general plan called the Portland Plan, which, due to community organizing, includes a racial equity strategy and a racial justice lens, actually very much tailored after Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. And part of that process was an acknowledgement of gentrification happening in the city of Portland, particularly due to urban renewal practices by the city in the 90s and 2000s. At the conclusion of that plan, the city commissioned a gentrification and displacement strategy study, in which it became really important that the city acknowledged its responsibility for public investments in infrastructure and economic development that happened without commensurate investments in affordable housing, in housing stability, access to opportunity, and a broader sense of community development. And also really started to recognize that the city, the planners, transportation staff, certainly people from the Housing Bureau, really have a role to play through regulating, shaping, and incentivizing the market, and through the careful direction of subsidy dollars for housing, and to really pay attention to where housing markets were heating up, what neighborhoods were changing. You see that's the map on the slide here, is looking at where vulnerable populations, okay, I can see right here.
Thank you
This
for that.
powerful image that only I can see will show you both where different stages of gentrification and the presence of highly vulnerable populations. The point in that planners needed to be really proactive in tracking neighborhood change and thinking about how to use tools and programs to be proactive. This has become really critical. Portland has one of the highest house price growth indexes in the country, both sales and rents. We have extremely low rental vacancies and a burgeoning crisis of homelessness on the streets. And as Kalima mentioned, people of color, which is including African American, Latino, and Asian Pacific Islander, are almost totally priced out of the city of Portland at this point. So the city has been working on 2 tracks, and I want to emphasize this is very much pushed by community organizing, community advocacy, to address seriously gentrification and the displacement of the African American community in particular, with a focused strategy to provide access to housing and economic opportunity, and a preference policy, which colloquially we can think of as a right to return and a right to stay. We can talk about that in more detail later. And also to recognize a need for anti-displacement work across all contexts of neighborhood change in our comprehensive land use plan. And again, ADPDX, the Anti-Displacement Portland Coalition, emerged to push the comprehensive plan to include fair housing, to include community continuity and housing stability goals, insisting that we move forward with anti-displacement tools for all neighborhood contexts. And in 2017, hopefully, the city of Portland will adopt a mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinance in accordance with those plan goals. So really, we're trying to link our anti-displacement policies to connect both gentrifying neighborhoods, but also the neighborhoods that are the destinations for those being displaced by gentrification, and a general sense of renters' housing instability.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm sorry the
Yep.
bell didn't have the volume on.
The end.
Okay, and next
Does
we
this
have,
work? Yeah.
next we have Tony.
So I have one slide, and it set the context and then talk about some adopted plans and strategies and what we're working on right now. So the context is very important. And I think one of the things I learned, even though Seattle's not a very diverse city, with 75% white, but our community, which is Southeast Seattle, is 80% of color. 60% of the population does not speak English as a first language. So we live in a very diverse community. But the more I learn about this planning things, the higher up you go, the less race is an issue, the more it gets whitewashed. And it's very important to set the context that 70% of land in Seattle is zoned single family, and it's the most restrictive single family code in the country. People of color historically were not allowed to own land, own property in Seattle, except for 2 neighborhoods. That's the Central District, which is historically African American, and the International District, which is Asian. And there's a fair number of Asians actually that lived in the Central District because they couldn't own land anywhere else. The third thing is that only 7% of Seattle's land is multifamily and allowed to be zoned higher than the most restrictive single-family zoning code, which means basically people of color are zoned out of Seattle to begin with in the first place. And the last point is that the lowest opportunity neighborhoods right now have become the most suitable for development and upzoning, and so has the highest displacement threats. Another context, two other context points is not in the slide. One is that we have very little transportation infrastructure. So we have a regional light rail system that's going in place. We've almost completed 2 phases, which is about $25 billion of investments, light rail corridor. We are now getting ready to go to the voters to pass a $54 billion package that will run through the next 25 to 30 years. The impact of $54 billion of public investment in our communities is huge. And historically what happens is the transit agencies use the transit dollars to do their projects. We have to go and find CDBG money to offset all the negative impacts. And so one of the fights right now is to make sure that transportation projects also include community development mitigation resources, because a lot of small cities don't even have CDBG money. Cities like Seattle, we actually have some resources. The other last context is that we have a Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, or HALA, which the mayor commissioned a group to work on the issue of how do we grow the city, and there's a strong equity element in it. So HALA is the HALA is the acronym for that. One of the things that we decided to do was the city was going through a major comp plan update called Seattle 2035. And so you can go on the internet and do that to find more specific information, Seattle 2035. And we decided that we wanted to do an equity analysis. And actually, I think PolicyLink helped us with some of that, to look at the neighborhoods that are most threatened and actually map. Now, we had done a lot of mapping with the HUD Regional Planning Grant, opportunity maps. We had created typologies for the 74 regional transit areas in terms of what areas had high opportunity, what areas had low opportunity, what areas had high likelihood of gentrification, and all that was mapped out. So we followed that methodology and used it in the Seattle neighborhoods. From that analysis, we were able to develop a equitable development implementation plan, which targeted primarily communities of color, the neighborhoods
We're
of color.
looking forward to hearing
with
more
specific
about
projects.
that
Okay,
in the
oops.
next questions. Thank you, Tony. Okay, next we have you, Olson.
Hi. So, who has heard about the Google buses in San Francisco? Okay, so very well-educated audience. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of what's happening in San Francisco. It gets exaggerated in part because the New York Times likes to do these San Francisco digs, and now they're going to do it on a regular basis. I understand, but it is really symptomatic of the whole notion of growth in San Francisco and what happens when you have growth. Clearly, in San Francisco, these are the best of times and worst of times. You know, we have a very low unemployment rate. We're building new office buildings, and that is good for the economy. This growth also comes on a housing production that has always lagged the demand, not just because of the recent Google buses, but it has lagged the demand for a very, very long time. And so we run, sort of head on between the lack of demand and all these new well-paying jobs in San Francisco, and that is sort of the essence of our crisis in San Francisco. As some of the speakers spoke earlier about the whole notion of the rising rents and the gentrification and displacement, that is indeed happening throughout the city overall. I was asked to say one thing that I would focus on if I was trying to solve this problem. And I think that, being from government and being responsible for the development and creation and preservation of housing, I would say the one thing is resources, because we can talk about this until we're blue in the face. But if we don't build housing or preserve housing or provide money for eviction defense or some of the other things, is my slide up? Yes. So look at the slide. That is only a portion of the things that we are doing to try to stabilize neighborhoods. But clearly the whole notion, and this is something that people talked about here, the projects, the site-specific affordable housing projects make a huge difference. And the question is, where are they where are they going to be in your community? How are they going to be funded? Who gets into those developments? And you can't build your way out of the crisis. It takes too long, takes too much money. And one of the things that New York City is doing, is focusing 60% of their money on acquisition rehab. We're the flip in San Francisco. We're focusing 60% of our money on new construction, 40% on rehab, in part because we have these old redevelopment project areas that we need to continue to build out. But it is really about the resources. You can do a lot of things if you have the money and the political will. And clearly in San Francisco, it is such a crisis at this point in terms of it is threatening our goal of being and maintaining a diversity, both economically and racially, in the city and what the city is known for.
Thank you, Olson. You can see how unrealistic it was to ask someone to frame their city in 2 minutes and how ineffective my bell is. Guacolda, let's see how you do.
I'm going to try my best to meet your deadline of the 2 minutes. So for that, I have to say, first of all, that what I'm going to share with you is not truly the City of Chicago framework. As it was mentioned in my little bio there, yes, I participated with the mayor's office in 2 important task forces. One was the one that was in charge of revising the affordable requirement ordinance. Don't pay attention to the slide for this 1 second. And then the second one was the City of Chicago Community Land Trust, because the idea was to preserve and to preserve affordability. So the affordable housing requirement, very briefly, talks about every time a developer asks for a zoning change, TIF assistance, or land, that he is required to provide affordable housing 10% as an exchange of the benefits that the developer is getting from the city. Very briefly, there are more details. You can find the City of Chicago and understand that. Now, my community, Pilsen, which is where my organization started 25 years ago, primarily doing community organizing and then community development. We started working in Pilsen, which is a community that is only probably 7 minutes in public transportation from downtown Chicago. So this meets the criteria earlier in regards of close to downtown as a target community to be gentrified. So we started 25 years ago to control of vacant lots, began doing affordable for sale homeownership with the support of the City of Chicago. Then we began to do rental affordable housing. So in the last 25 years, we were the first one with public dollars to begin to invest in our community. So in 2005, developers were looking at our community, and we met with the alderman, and through a mandate of a referendum, it was decided that it was going to be community participation every time the alderman was asked for a zoning change. So he created a group of people that represented the community organizations, and that's how we arrived, that's how we arrived through that process to create what we define as community benefit, being the 21% that probably now you see in the slide as what is the process. I think the goal so far is that we've been able to stop almost 800 units of market rate housing. And if you compare Pilsen with the Humboldt Park community a little bit on the north, they have seen the development of 2,000 units of housing in 2016. So clearly that community is gentrified. Ours, I can proudly say, it's not there yet.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Clayton. I'm Devin Quirk. I'm from the City of Boston's Department of Neighborhood Development. We're the Housing and Community Development Agency for the City of Boston. And like all of my colleagues here today, Boston is facing a crisis of housing affordability. And we had our first new mayor elected in 20 years, 2 years ago. And recognizing this, Mayor Walsh, when he took office, one of the first things he did was was to convene a housing task force to look at housing affordability in our city, and that brought together a large group of stakeholders from across government, but also the nonprofit community. LISC was an important part of that task force as well. I'm trying to get my mic here, I don't get the feedback. And yeah, let's do that. How's that? A little bit better? A little bit better. Thank you. Let's turn the other one off. How about that? That might help. How's that? All right. So after many working groups, after bringing together this task force that came from across government, across nonprofits, like I said, LISC was there. We had affordable housing finance professionals. We had for-profit real estate developers as part of this task force. We put together a housing strategy for the city that looked at the next 15 years in Boston's development and what do we want to accomplish, what are the strategies we want to pursue that will make Boston a more affordable place to live for people of all incomes and all backgrounds, a place where everyone can afford to call home. And there's a lot of different chapters to the plan. It's online. It's 150 pages long if you want a little light reading. But for instance, we have a chapter on student housing because Boston has over 200,000 students coming to Boston every year, and that creates a tremendous strain on our housing market. From across the entire plan, however, there's this focus on racial equity, social equity, displacement, and gentrification. And if you bucket the tools that we're talking about across all chapters of the plan, they really come down to three different strategies for addressing displacement in our city. And the first are market-driven tools to increase housing supply. The second are subsidy tools where government can use different financial resources to create affordable housing. And the third are more regulatory and policy-based tools to protect tenants who live in market-rate housing and help them stay in their homes. And I think one statement I'd like to make is that I believe you need all three of those strategies in order to be successful. I don't think there's a silver bullet. If there's a silver bullet, hopefully we can learn it today. But I think more realistically, displacement is a really multifaceted problem, and you need a lot of different solutions working at a lot of different scales in order to be effective. And I'll just very briefly touch quickly on one or two strategies from each. Klima will let me, or we can, okay, I'm allowed, I'll go a few minutes longer. On the market-driven side, it was really about adding housing supply. Like all the cities that were presented today, we have a supply-demand imbalance. We've created very little housing over the past 3 or 4 decades, and now we're catching up as our population grows. We know we need to build 53,000 units of housing by 2030, and that's a 20% increase in Boston's residential density just to keep up with the projected population growth. But I think it's also important to mention that it's not a grow-at-all-costs strategy. We have very specific goals around housing creation at the low-income level, the middle-income level, and the market rate level. And we expect the private market to be a very major player in creating affordable housing. So I'll stop there and I'll talk a little bit more about the other two strategies.
Yeah, we can talk about it when we get into the strategies. Thank you all so much. So I'm wondering if in laying out the dynamic of trying to put forward a framework in your city, what the political or process dynamics have been that have allowed that to take root. So Olson, maybe I'll start with you. I feel like San Francisco has been so much in the hot seat.
Well, I have this saying that if you put 10 San Franciscans in a room, you get 12 opinions. And we really have a great citizen participation process, and it's really long and involved, and there's an opportunity to participate in many, many forums. As we have developed the plans for our affordable housing strategy, I think a lot of it was done at the Board of Supervisors, where citizens groups would come, and they would just basically lobby against any market rate development. They really felt that the market rate development was the source of all evil in San Francisco, and if we could stop it, things would go back to the good times. The reality is, if we were to go to the extreme and stop all market rate development, the prices would not stop. They would absolutely continue to rise, and there wouldn't be any revenues from my standpoint because I benefit from market rate development for the creation of affordable housing. So I think that really it was a lot of citizen activism at the Board of Supervisors. The board became very, very involved, and then therefore the mayor came very, very involved to look at the question of how do we deal with the question of growth and in rents. And unfortunately, it happened at the same time that the redevelopment agency was going away. We recovered from the recession quicker than other parts of the country, and so we were, hit with the whole question of the recession, ending the recession and the loss of redevelopment. The mayor tried to address that, and the citizens voted overwhelmingly for a $1.5 billion housing trust fund, funds out of the general fund to go solely for the creation of affordable housing. And they doubled down on that a year ago with a $310 million bond issuance because the Housing Trust Fund wasn't going as fast as possible. And now we're, again, before the voters for another $300 million bond issuance for acquisition rehab of existing properties because the community feels that that has the greatest benefit in terms of helping existing individuals within their neighborhoods. So I would say that the discussion was really a grassroots discussion, and it came through the various public bodies that we have. The Planning Commission obviously was a site of many, many 11-hour meetings about development. And through all this, I think that the city leadership really is really is aware of the problem and is trying to address the problem as best that we can. Unfortunately, we can't move as fast as the citizens would like, but I think we are in the process of creating 500 units of affordable housing in the Mission. We're doing a small sites acquisition program for rent-controlled buildings that might be Ellis. And we're creating some preferences for people who are Ellis, who are subject to, Ellis. This was the state law, not the city law that was referenced in the first panel, which allows owners to get out of the business of rental housing. So in preparation for selling it as a condo or a co-op or a TIC. And it's a cause of much of the, well, not much of it, it's really the focal point of many individuals about displacement. So we've created a preference for those individuals who are subject to the Ellis Act so they can get into affordable housing. We've also created a preference for sort of the tenants who were subject to the owner move-ins to try to mitigate the impact to those families, to those households of being displaced. But in answer to the first question, it's really about the grassroots activism on this issue, bringing the leadership of the city along with it.
Thank you. Lisa, could you say a little bit about the political and process dynamics in Portland that have gotten you to where you are?
Definitely. So I referenced to the City of Portland's gentrification and displacement strategy study. It's a pretty good report. I wrote it. You could read it. That report, it was written really to the audience of people who work for the City of Portland, to planners and folks in the infrastructure and economic development agencies. And that report led to maps, more maps, crosswalking tables of toolkits, talking about what data we don't have and need to have. So in other words, it went into a bureaucratic sort of spiral. And people in the community really weren't aware or engaged with picking up any of those pieces. And so while the city was thinking about making plans, sort of resource allocations were happening business as usual. What really was a really significant turning point in the city of Portland was that the Portland African American Leadership Forum, which is a sort of a coalition and convening organization in Portland, invited the mayor and the director of our urban renewal agency to come to Northeast Portland to look at North Williams Avenue, which had been the center of the Black Business District and is now essentially unrecognizable to anyone who was in Portland even 10 years ago. And, many tears were shed and heartfelt statements were made. And 2 weeks later, the Portland Development Commission announced the They were going to do a land deal on a significant site at the corner of Martin Luther King Boulevard and Alberta Ave to I'll leave it unnamed brand name grocery store with no community benefits agreement, no investment in affordable housing. And essentially the community just said no. There was a complete uprising and outcry that this was absolutely unacceptable. We've just had this conversation, you've just made these commitments, and you need to be held accountable. The deal did fall apart, and that the result was a reallocation of tax increment financing in the urban renewal district toward affordable housing and the creation of a strategy for that urban renewal district, which would be specifically oriented to fulfilling many, many broken promises over some decades of activity there after redlining that went well into the 1990s and disinvestment, that there would be a creation of housing and that there would be a really specific effort to try to stabilize the remaining African American residents. The neighborhoods are now about 20% black after being 80 to 90% black at one point, and to bring folks back. And so it was really this community outcry, and then the rising other groups of other communities of color who were seeing their own histories of displacement historically, in our Asian Pacific Islander community, which is actually at this point mostly more recent immigrants than long-term residents, because we have a very deep history of anti-Asian racism also in Portland, sort of reconnecting to the history of the displacement of Chinatown in Portland, speaking about what we call New Chinatown, and the threats there, the Latino community organizing in the neighborhood of Coley, and starting to build this coalition to hold accountable. And it's really been through that community organizing and coalition building that the city has been really pushed to take action that is not just plans, but actually allocates resources.
Devin, since you are representing a city, then we'll go to neighborhoods after you. So how about?
Yeah, great. And maybe I'll make the transition in between. So I think I was speaking to the broad coalition of people we brought together to build the affordable housing plan for the city, and I think that's a really important place to start for getting political support and will to do something differently in the city. And I think the three-pronged approach of having a market-driven strategy, an affordable housing production strategy, and a displacement and a tenancy protection strategy is really important, because I don't think all stakeholders can agree across all three strategies, but everyone's going to find their strategies within that framework. So we try to build that out at the citywide level, and I think speaking to the 53,000 units of housing that we need to build on the production side, I think we'd be foolish to believe that production alone would get us to the affordability goals that we need to reach. Although we're anticipating or requiring very ambitious affordable housing set-asides, we know we also have to put public money into creating affordable housing. So that's a part of building that coalition. We're ramping up our acquisition programs. It's a huge part of where we want to use that funding. And my department owns the city's surplus real estate inventory, and that's an important tool in our arsenal as well, making sure that goes to the creation of affordable housing as well. And in partnership with new ideas, some of which have tried and true in Boston. We have a really strong community land trust in the Dudley neighborhood, Dudley Neighbors Incorporated, but there's been a lot of community advocacy around expanding that to other neighborhoods. And on the tenant protection side, we're really proud to have just launched an Office of Housing Stability that is a central one-stop shop for people who are facing eviction, facing displacement, whether that's today or maybe on the longer term as rents rise, a one-stop shopping for them to have a phone number that they can call, get case management, get resource supports, and get policy advocacy. So across those three pillars, having a citywide strategy and then quickly turning that into a neighborhood-based approach. So we're now undergoing our first. I think it's important to note that the city's affordable housing strategy is not a land use plan. It's a housing affordability plan. And we've been working hard to quickly turn that into action, into land use changes in neighborhoods, because that's where the rubber really meets the road. And the strategies in each neighborhood probably mean a slightly different deployment. So we're working on rezoning one transit-oriented neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, it's Jamaica Plain and Roxbury in Boston, the Washington Street corridor, and it's very clear that diversity preservation in that neighborhood means that at least 30% of all new housing created must be deed restricted, income restricted, affordable housing in order to meet those goals that we all advanced at the citywide level. So I think moving quickly from citywide broad coalition into neighborhood planning is an important part of accomplishing our goals.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue to the work that you've been doing, Wakolda. And I think one of the things that I've been hearing, right, is cultural preservation needs neighborhood plans. And that when you have bold production goals in your city, which you need to keep up with population growth, it can be in tension and conflict with the cultural preservation of neighborhoods. So if you could just speak at that intersection of what you did at the neighborhood level and how that meets the broader goals of the city of Chicago and how you've learned to navigate that.
I think that we've been very lucky because at the time that we created this Pilsen Land Use Committee with the aldermen, it was 2005, and we were getting ready because we were already getting requests from developers. But then the market crashed, and that kind of gave us the time that we needed to put together the processes that we have. So we felt very strongly, and we still do today, more than 25 years ago when my organization began working in Pilsen, that we need to preserve the community, the culture, the history that we have. Pilsen has been for the last 150 years a port of entry of immigrants. First with Eastern Europeans, and then since 1950 more or less, Mexican Americans. So for us, as you saw in the slides earlier, our culture, our history is extremely, extremely important. And we've been able to work with the same alderman because he knows that we, as the community organizations that are behind this Pilsen Land Use Committee, he knows that we bring the residents, we bring the people that can vote, right? Can vote for him or against him. So he's been able to accommodate our request. So the city has the 10%, we have the 21%. The city is going to target incomes at 60%. Pilsen has incomes at 30%, 40%, and 50%, 7% each one of those income brackets. Because we want to preserve the culture, we want to preserve the emotional mapping that earlier Kai was talking about, the voices that Nancy was talking about earlier. We cannot preserve those if developers come and put 500 units of housing that none of that housing even is going to be for the families that are in the community. And yes, some people may argue, but you lost the opportunity of creating, that 21% that you guys were talking about. But it doesn't, for us, we lost the 21%. Maybe is the cost of preserving the community. Because the minute that we would allow those developers, the ones that wanted to comply with the 21, which truly none of them wanted to comply with the 21, so it was their decision at the end, not ours. But even if one of them would have been able to do it and we would have gained that 21 would have created a ripple effect of increasing the rents near those properties. So clearly, we are trying to make an effort to look for that equitable balance between what means to preserve the community and what means to say no to developments that truly are going to completely displace the community. As we are seeing it on the north part of Chicago, like I mentioned earlier, last year 2,000 units were built in one community, primarily Puerto Ricans. That's not the case anymore. because they cannot afford it, and there goes the murals, and there goes the festivals. And so for us it's been very important, and we've been in a way, I don't know if it is luck or what, but we've been able to have an alderman that truly understand, because in Chicago the alderman has the power to authorize zoning changes. So it's in their hands to define the community. So it's true that we have seen a lot of development in 2015, and we have seen fewer in 2016, because the development community knows that if you want to build in Pilsen, you have to do 21%. So that the fact that other people in other circles are talking about us, it's extremely good for us. So yeah.
Thank you, Wacholda. And Tony, I think that you have been able to advance processes and policies. How has that come about in Seattle?
Well, actually, we owe a lot to the HUD Regional Planning Grant, because that really resourced. We had a good metropolitan planning organization that was willing to work with the community, and we created a regional equity network, which resourced community engagement. And the thing about community engagement is that it's got to be sustained, and the community needs to be at the table at the formative part of the process, not at the end. The other thing is that the community needs to have authorization power. So one of the things about what we adopted, the regional compacts that we adopted from the HUD Regional Planning Grant, had to be, the community was at the steering committee level. And so the biggest challenge we had was actually convincing our transit agency to allow the word displacement to be included in the regional compacts, believe it or not. And the only way we were even going to be able to get that word in there was because we were at the table, and if they didn't have our votes, the compact wasn't going to get through. We also had a challenge grant in our neighborhood, which also resourced community engagement. So we actually had community members on a sustained basis come to the meetings, work with the planners. That's absolutely important. Now, if you look at the projects that are on our Equitable Development Implementation Plan for Central District, International District in Southeast Seattle, housing is actually a very small component of that. Cultural preservation and economic mobility are the biggest things. The community actually wanted jobs, and they wanted to be able to keep their ethnic community centers. It's what they really wanted. The perception in the community right now is that we have a lot of affordable housing, because we're historically the low-income communities. Many of our housing, that's changing very quickly, but the perception is that what we really need is jobs. We need to be able to, go to our community centers and get services, go to restaurants that have food that we like to eat. So it's a real mix. The Housing Affordable and Livability Agenda, which is 65 recommendations for affordable housing, actually deals a lot more with the housing affordability piece. But the comp plan actually, because of the community engagement, actually deals a lot more with cultural issues and economic mobility issues.
Thank you. So I heard a lot in that of revenue, right to return, acquisition and land banking, tenant protection, and services for housing stability, income targeting at the income levels of actual residents, and power over zoning changes at the localized level. All that's a mouthful, right? What are the most relevant tools? Like when you think about, in Oakland, over the last decade, 34,000 African Americans were displaced from my community. And so when you think about these strategies, that development takes years to play out. So what are the most powerful tools, impact-wise, that you are implementing? Who wants to go first?
So I think I'd like to back up Olson's comment and say the resources are the most powerful tools, right? For every dollar that we raise at the local level to spend on affordable housing, we're able to leverage $7 in state and federal tax credits and other resources. So having more funding to create more affordable housing, to subsidize development, I think is the biggest way to achieve our affordability and anti-displacement goals. That said, I think some of the the strategies that we're trying now, the new thinking or the things that are changing the game for us. One is our acquisition strategy. So we've just launched an occupied housing acquisition strategy where we're purchasing market rate development, or helping CDCs purchase market rate development and convert that into affordable housing. And that does two things. It immediately creates affordable housing. You have to wait for it to be constructed. But it's also an anti-displacement strategy. It's keeping those tenants in place, and it's preventing them from being displaced. The downside is it's expensive. It's particularly in rapidly gentrifying high-cost neighborhoods. And the second part of our acquisition program is more of a land banking program, something we're working very closely with LISCOM and their transit-oriented development fund, or acquisition fund, to be able to purchase underutilized land or vacant buildings and convert that to affordable housing through our traditional sources. So those are two very, very powerful tools. And then I think another game changer for us has been our Office of Housing Stability, having one place where the people who are actually facing displacement can call and get coordinated access to resources. The city is not going to be able to provide all those resources by any means, but what we can provide is coordination and referrals to some of the very effective community development organizations and advocacy organizations in our city, and make sure that every case gets followed up on. We're also embarking through the Office of Housing Stability on more data and analysis efforts, having a better understanding of where evictions are happening and being proactive, and also advancing new policy. We want to pass a just cause eviction ordinance that's before the City Council now, so that's something else that could be a game changer in Boston.
So I'd like to just stick on the buckets that you just built up to see how those things are playing out across cities. I heard the researchers panel mention that this morning, of turning to preservation strategies and acquisition of existing housing. And so if anybody is pursuing that in your city, could you talk about how you are doing that?
The city of San Francisco is doing a couple things in terms of sort of acquisition and preservation of existing affordable housing and also existing market rate housing. One of the biggest affordable housing resources in San Francisco was the Housing Authority property, and that was really being severely disinvested. And so the mayors, both Mayor Newsom and especially Mayor Lee, who grew up in public housing, have really stressed the preservation of that affordable housing stock. And so hopefully in about 2 weeks, we're closing on phase 2 of our rental assistance demonstration project, which is the acquisition and rehab, refinancing, rehabilitation of 3,400 units of affordable housing in San Francisco that was at risk of loss, not because of gentrification, but just because of underinvestment. So clearly saving, and the total project cost for for the deal geeks is $2 billion. And the city was able to leverage 20 to 1 to preserve this wonderful affordable housing stock. And not only were we preserving the stock, but changing the way the stock is going to be operated into the future, including on-site services and connections to the city services overall. There are other opportunities.
I just have one question. I heard you saying at lunch, typically the redevelopment of public housing displaces everybody who lives in it, and by the time it's rebuilt, they aren't there anymore. So what are you doing different in San Francisco?
We've made a commitment to have 100% retention. That is a goal, obviously, and it's, we're not going to probably reach 100%. But having that as a goal and basically saying to all the private developers who are coming in and being a part of this transaction, both for-profit and nonprofit, it really says you're going to manage people in. You're not going to take this opportunity as you get control of this housing stock to manage people out. That the residents of these public housing units count, and we're doing this for them. So that was a big statement, in part because we needed political support even to go forward with the transaction. And clearly, if we were not doing it for the residents, there was not going to be the political support to do the transaction.
Thank you, Olson. I'll let you get a drink before I make you say anything more. Is anybody else doing acquisition and preservation strategies in your city that you want to comment on?
I can share what my organization is doing in Pilsen besides the zoning change, which has been so far the most productive tool. We're also doing preservation. We acquire an SRO, the only SRO in the Pilsen community, so it was extremely important for us to preserve that so we could preserve the affordability. And we're also acquiring a a market rate building in operations because we believe that if we let it to go to another developer, that the rents are going to be above 80%, which is the rent levels that the tenants pay right now. So in a way, we are trying to put together a comprehensive a strategy that is not just the zoning change, right? But that also is going to include property owners, in particular those that have local businesses, because we want to preserve the local businesses. And also we are talking about, little by little, educating the aldermen on rent restrictions. So we need to be creative about how we're going to educate him on that matter, because everything that has the word restrictions create a significant challenge for him. But we are doing the zoning, we're doing the preservation and acquisition of properties in operations that are market rate.
We don't have, because of the density, preservation is not a huge issue now. We passed a $300 million housing trust fund recently, of which 10% was allocated to do acquisition rehab. But I think our we have pretty strong tenant protection in terms of relocation, that landlords have to, developers have to pay for low-income families, using the building code so that if you can't increase the rent by a certain amount if you're not code compliant. So there's a lot of more tenant protection things that we have to try to keep existing tenants in their homes.
So, Lisa, do you have anything to say on that topic? No? Okay, so the next bucket that I heard Devin raise was this land banking or use of public land or acquisition of land to land bank. And so I'm interested in how people are pursuing that strategy. I heard the state of New York saying that they are thinking about those resources.
So land banking is something which there was a tremendous amount of community advocacy around as an anti-displacement strategy. And I think someone asked in the first panel, how do you convince the city that it's a good idea? And I think the city of Portland has largely been convinced that it's a good idea, but actually doing it is on another level. And I think the challenges that they've found is, one, having that kind of ears on the street to know about what's going to be coming on the market, know the pocket listings, the relationships in the land transactions, because in this hot market, you cannot wait until a sign goes up on the property or it comes on the official listings. It's already gone, and their ability to bid very aggressively is not. They can't bid in very aggressively where prices might be going up 25% over listing, and so that's where they become a little bit challenged. The city has been able to purchase one piece of property off the market, but what they did agree to was that all city bureaus, other than the housing bureau, that have property, that own vacant properties, if they declare them surplus, that they have a right of first refusal to the housing bureau to purchase or acquire for affordable housing first before putting it out on the market, which has been a challenge because some of the ratepayer agencies have some limitations on how they are able to do property disposition, and they need to earn back ratepayer dollars. But to have that kind of right of first refusal, to date, that hasn't happened. People have their property, but they're not surplusing it; they're just holding it. And so that's kind of a next question, particularly for community advocates: is what would be the strategy there? Are there particular parcels that are very strategic and important that we want to see surplus and can advocate directly to get those onto the surplus list for housing?
One of the things that we were able to do when our transit agency went to the state legislature to get authorization to pass the $54 billion Sound Transit 3 was work with our state house leadership to require that 80% of the land, surplus land that the transit agency buys for their rail and station, have to then go to housing that's below 80% of area median income, and specifically the nonprofit developers. So that was a very significant thing that we were able to get actually for transit to understand the housing, because many of our sites, because of the zoning patterns that we have, are actually TOD sites. We have very few, or transit-oriented development sites. We have very few strictly residential land. So that was actually very important to create an inventory of surplus property. And then as part of the HUD regional planning grant, one of the things was to create an acquisition fund. So we just finished, actually, finally, about 7 years later, with a $20 million acquisition fund.
Just surplus city properties are a great resource. And just thinking about some of the properties that I currently control for use as a permanently affordable housing. We do what we call 99-year ground leases in the city, in part because under the preservation crisis in the 90s, I had to buy back redevelopment properties at $50,000 a door land costs when the original redevelopment agency sold them for $500 a door. So I said, we're never going to do this again. And so all of our affordable housing is done on ground leases with the exception of our small sites. But we've acquired properties from the San Francisco School District, from our Department of Public Works, from the port, and we've also had parcels provided through rezoning, redevelopment project areas, where part of the rezoning included paper city streets and other parcels, and we swapped them with the market rate developers so we can have an inclusive community for the future. I think one of the incredible successes of the redevelopment agency was the ability to plan the affordable housing as part of the redevelopment plan, both in terms of the financing as well as the land, and so that there was never a question of not in my backyard. We were always going to be there because we were there as part of the original plan. And so we have 3 remnant redevelopment project areas, Trans Bay, Mission Bay, and Hunters Point Shipyard, and all of those exceed 30% affordable housing in very, very expensive environments. Trans Bay is a high-rise luxury developments, and what we have are on the same parcels what we call affordable housing shoulders. It's not pour door. It's affordable housing shoulders, and these are 100% affordable developments. So clearly, city properties and rezonings where you're giving the developers the opportunity to increase entitlements are an opportunity to secure land for affordable housing. And if you get that land, hold that land forever because you're always going to need that affordable housing.
Thank you. Devin, could you tell us about Boston's community investment tax credit?
So I think the question might be about the Community Preservation Act that's on the ballot in November, and I think this goes back to the resources question again. I think a theme throughout today has been this question of, is housing a human right? And I certainly believe that, but a lot of the need and the advocacy is to get our resources to line up against our belief that housing is a human right, and we're going to fund it as such. And that's, I think, at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And at the local level, in Boston, or actually the state of Massachusetts has what's called the Community Preservation Act. It's a opportunity for communities at the city level to, by ballot initiative, increase their property taxes and assess themselves a higher property tax rate to fund affordable housing, open space, and historic development. At least 10% of each of the funding raised has to go to all 3 of those uses, but that could mean up to 80% of the funding could go to anyone, such as affordable housing. And it's a 1% increase on the tax payments, not the basis, but how much you're paying in taxes today. The average Bostonian, that would be about $38 a year, and that could create over $20 million of revenue on an annual basis that we could bond against and create affordable housing. So it's a pretty powerful tool in Boston that we could pass this November.
So I hear in that align interests with other sectors to get ballot votes for affordability. This first right of return preference policy that Portland and Seattle have been advancing, how does that work in the fair housing construct that we operate under?
So the preference policy that I think is kind of currently in under controversy with HUD is like a geographic radius from development policy. Portland's preference policy operates a little bit differently. It is based on the geography of urban renewal area designation over from 2000, which is the most recent urban renewal area designation, back into the 50s. And so a person can get prioritized on the list for city subsidized housing and also some other kinds of units that the city regulates based on living or having lived inside these boundaries where the city recognizes having done harm through its urban renewal actions. And that would count for both yourself, your parent, and grandparent. So it explicitly recognizes as intergenerational impacts of displacement and disruption and the intergenerational impacts of actually multiple waves of urban renewal. And so far, so good in the fair housing construct. It's very much linked and connected to the conversation about affirmatively furthering fair housing and an attempt to give people access to neighborhoods which are now, very high opportunity in all senses of the word, very physically and economically different from how they were through the 80s and 90s. But also have had massive cultural displacement. So again, you can be returning or you might be staying if you are still there, but it's kind of a broader sense of how you get preference into this housing.
We don't have that, but I learned that San Francisco does. So Len also talk about that.
Well, as we were talking earlier, we have a variety of preferences, and we're in the process of working out a neighborhood preference and trying to sort of pass fair housing muster on it. Initially, HUD said no. But they're reconsidering, and hopefully we will get an answer from them soon. They'll be a little bit more positive than no. Clearly, neighborhood preferences was the Board of Supervisors and the mayor's solution to the question of displacement, and whether in terms of allowing residents to stay in these neighborhoods that are undergoing gentrification and change, and giving those residents the first opportunity for the affordable housing that was built in that community. So to ensure that they could stay and remain a part of that community. So we're struggling right now to come up with a solution that HUD likes better. But we really hope to do something, because the whole notion of providing these opportunities to these neighborhood residents is really, really important, because HUD recognizes other forms of displacement, displacement from our old redevelopment areas. We have the certificate of preference for people displaced by old urban renewal. We have the Ellis and the Ellis Act preference and the owner move-in preference. And in our discussions with HUD, we just said, why do you want to wait until somebody's actually harmed before we can provide the benefit? Can we be more proactive about mitigating the impacts of this trauma, of displacement and relocation on these families? And so we will see, whether those arguments make a difference in how HUD thinks about the fair housing as it relates to sort of neighborhood preferences.
Can I add one quick thing on that? So we're also exploring a neighborhood preference for the reasons that Olson just mentioned, and I think one tension is between perpetuating segregation, which we can all agree is a negative and an outcome to be avoided, and preserving diversity, which I think aligns with the goals and the values of everyone in this room. And so, as we're crafting what we originally called our neighborhood preference, and now we are calling our diversity preservation preference, ensuring that the way in which that preference is enacted, that it doesn't perpetuate segregation, that the people who are eligible to receive the preference and the outcome of that housing lottery will have the effect of preserving the diversity of the neighborhood.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end of our time. I was profoundly struck by the HRC plan for the state of New York, being from a state that doesn't have such a robust and comprehensive plan. But I know that federal, state, and local housing policy have profound interactions and need to work together. And so I'm wondering if any of the panelists want to say anything about promising actions that your states are taking to complement the things that you are doing locally in your high-cost cities, or things you need from the feds.
Well, we're pretty excited in Portland that the Speaker of Oregon's House has just announced that she will go after lifting the state preemptions on rent regulation and just cause evictions this year. These are obvious tools for addressing tenant stabilization that the city either cannot do at all, or at least city attorneys are not willing to push the envelope any further to try to test out possible ways of getting around some of the preemptions. Just contextually, many renters at all income levels, but particularly low-income renters in Portland rent on a 30-day, month-to-month lease, which can be terminated at any time without cause. So, right, and we don't know, because it's also, you don't really need to file anything to end a 30-day lease. So that kind of instability is something that is quite serious and needs to be addressed. But I think on a more positive front, we are, people are, both on the community advocacy side and in terms of our government agencies, really picking up the AFFH framework and trying to use that to think differently, to say, we can't just say, oh, our black-white segregation index dropped, we're doing great, which was the story of the 2010 census, until suddenly people realize, the velocity of that is such that actually we're moving very quickly to just having another majority black ghetto in a different location. That's not great. So being able to, I think, broaden our concept and think within that AFFH framework and look at maps and look at data and be in the conversation around that has been very powerful, moving us toward our comprehensive land use planning and our new urban renewal strategies.
I would say the resources thing clearly, but not one silver bullet. You got to have a whole menu of tools. So a few things that our state did over the years. One is it enabled us. We are very much of a property rights state. Strong takings, constitutional prohibitions. They passed legislation which allowed us to do mandatory inclusionary zoning at the state level, which enabled, like City of Seattle, to actually have a mandatory housing program. The surplus property thing I talked about earlier with the regional transit agencies, another one. The state also enabled our counties to use hotel motel taxes to dedicate. So King County, which is the county that Seattle resides in, passed a hotel motel tax dedicated to transit-oriented development, workforce housing. So the state was able to enable a much more menu of resources at the local level, in addition to a state housing trust fund and local levies.
I would just say that some communities are really trying to address these problems, and other communities are sort of putting their head in the sand and not doing anything. And really, one of the roles of state government is trying to make sure that everybody is chipping in. We have a serious housing problem across, whether it's, the gentrified neighborhoods, whether it's homeless, whether it's, just low-income, workers who have to commute 3 hours to get to a job. And we need the leadership at the state level, because the state can preempt a lot of the locals or incentivize the locals in terms of their housing policy. And we really need that at the state level, because San Francisco can do all that it can, but it is one city, 49 square miles, and we can't do it for the entire Bay Area or Northern California. We need all the communities to be thinking about affordable housing as a problem, as something that affects their current residents and the kids of their current residents.
Very briefly, unfortunately, the state of Illinois right now, they're not really concentrating on housing, given the budget crisis that we have. We still are running the state without a budget for this calendar year. So the Illinois Housing Development Authority, which is the authority that controls the funding, primarily reduced their affordable housing policy to 9% and 4% low-income housing tax credits. So it's extremely competitive, but this is what we have. That's what we're able to use. Now, the city of Chicago came out early in the year with their next 5-year affordable housing plan, again, using the traditional tools, low-income housing tax credit, TIF, even though now TIF is going to be dedicated to protect the public schools. So most likely that's going to create another gap for the financing of affordable housing in the city. And then slowly but surely, we're seeing more and more development throughout the downtown area, and the city with the ARO has been able, it's better than what we have back in 2007. So even though the 2015 version is not perfect, it's progress. So we expect to see around 90 millions that are going to be collected from these for the fees that some of the developers are going to pay, and that 90 million is going to be allocated to affordable housing project back in the neighborhoods as a way of a soft funding. I believe they project to do 12,000 units within those 10% of affordable for the next 5 years. So those are the plans that the city has. So at least we will be able to closely monitor if that is being done accordingly or not.
I just agree with everything my colleagues just said. I think resources are tremendously important. I think we're doing a pretty good job in Boston creating affordable housing at the 50 and 60% AMI level. I think we need more tools to get more deeply affordable housing at the 30% AMI level and below. I also agree about the regionalism comment is really important. I think all the cities represented here are really committed to housing equity, but housing markets are regional, and we need to address this at a regional level.
Well, thanks. I've just asked my colleagues to think about one thing that they learned today that they're going to take home with them. And so, who would like to go first?
I'll just say again, I think the conversation that many people have said, or the comment many people have said today about housing being a human right and making that a part of our narrative and our dialogue going forward, I think is an incredibly important way of framing the conversation going forward.
Well, I'm extremely motivated by being here and learning so much, so I can truly put some names to some of the effects that I'm seeing in my Pilsen neighborhood. But I think the struggle continues. I don't think we are out of the hood yet, but I think that particular I'm interested in looking more about tenant rent protections, because I believe that we're not going to be able to stop every single developer. And so for the current landlords, I think that this is something that we need to look at.
I would say don't forget who we're trying to serve, the residents and the neighborhoods. And as busy as we all are, and as many meetings as we all go to take the opportunity to stop and listen.
I actually learned a lot from the data panel, because we're going towards a data-driven approach to do equity. And so the idea of the retail data piece is one that I had not heard of. So that's one thing I definitely want to follow up on.
Well, I think, like probably everyone here, I was really moved by Kai's opening and his admonition to keep the people and the stories in mind. And so I connect that with what you were saying, Tony, about having the community engagement up front, that we got to really bring those stories into the policy making from the start.
could you join me in giving this wonderful panel a round of applause?